Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Medicines Discovery Catapult webinar. My name is Dan. I work in marketing at MDC, but it's not me you've come to hear from today. You're going to hear from Mark Davies. He's our business development manager in for our informatics team. So Mark is an experienced scientist himself. He got a PhD in biological sciences from the University of Warwick way back in time. He worked at AstraZeneca for about 12 years and also ran his own consultancy for about 5 years, and then joined us to do business development for informatics. So he's an experienced scientist himself with a bit of background in data and understanding how to get data to work in drug discovery. His presentation today is all about how collaboration is the key to getting success in drug discovery from data. Just to let you know, so if you have any questions as the presentation goes along, please just pop them in the Q&A, which is available at the bottom of the screen. Just pop them in there as you're going along, whenever you like. And then when we get to the end, Mark will have a look at those questions and Q&A and see if there's any which ones to answer. So as we're going along, I'll be looking after the chat and things as well. So if you have anything you want to pop in there, please do. But without further ado, I'll pass you on to Mark.
Thank you, Dan. Just a quick sound check. You can hear me okay?
You sound perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Well, the lights have just gone on in my room, but that's okay. So yeah, today I'm going to just talk a little bit about certainly how we see here at the MDC about this idea of data sharing, how data sharing is useful for science, but also some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that it presents. So we'll have a little bit about a talk about some of the backgrounds. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of the material that I'll present. And then towards the end, we'll start talking a little bit more about how the Medicines Discovery Catapult is approaching those problems and actually trying to sort of solve it, you know, and supporting the sector in this challenge. So connecting the wires, making sure that we're that data is flowing, because my hypothesis here is that science requires more, not less, collaboration and sharing of data. And if we didn't believe that before, the last month and a half has shown us exactly why this is absolutely the key. So first, sort of essentially my disclaimer slide really is that this isn't anything new. It's not like no one's thought about sort of collaboration and data sharing. This gentleman at the bottom, which I'm sure all of you will be able to recognize as Tim Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web. I think sometimes you get into trouble when you start saying you created the internet and all these things, and people say, well, actually you didn't. But that came from really a need for sharing of data within the physics community. And so the Large Hadron Collider, for instance, and this is a quote from a paper that I'll reference later on in the talk. You know, this is something that just wouldn't have happened without collaboration. You know, 10,000 scientists, engineers from across the globe have participated in a huge, big science collaborative project in order to make advances in the physics community. And, you know, this is the type of area that we look to and to say it can work and it can be done. It's not in isolation, and there's plenty of opportunities, plenty of examples of big science. Climate modeling, for instance, is another really nice example of where data sharing and people thinking about some of the issues with data sharing, how people get recognition for data sharing, for instance, has already been sort of discussed. I guess probably for most of us on the call, where we think about from a data sharing is much more in the drug discovery, drug development, healthcare setting. And I think healthcare is, you know, is a really interesting aspect, and many organizations are going through what is this term, this digital transformation, which is moving from very much sort of much more paper-based exercises or data sets that sit in isolation, and making them much more transparent, much more sort of connected, much more homogeneous within organizations. On this figure over on the right-hand side, from a few years ago from JAMA, is a really nice example of the types of data and information that is used within the healthcare systems, but also gives you some indication of how much of it is structured and how actually a lot of it is also unstructured. So you know, doctors' notes, for instance, clinicians' sort of notes aren't always connected up. So huge challenges, and a lot of challenges that are much more complex than you might get in the sort of physics or the climate modeling aspects. So there are definitely things to keep in mind. And of course, fundamentally, what we've got to recognize is the patient and the person, and you know, that includes everyone on this call. We're all involved with this too, and the need for caution and sort of security at all times about what we're doing. But the opportunities of being able to connect up this data so much more is manifold. So insights into the epidemiology of disease, for instance, helping us to look and check on our clinical decision making, helping us to look and check about how the timeliness of those clinical decision making, for instance, by learning about what is happening at a much broader scale, are all the sort of the types of benefits that we'll gain. I saw a LinkedIn post this morning, for instance, that was talking about people who have sat around, spent entire weekends sort of hacking through healthcare data in order to start understanding why patients are more susceptible to COVID infection than others. And, you know, these are the types of things that only happen as a result of connecting, linking the sort of data that we're talking about. So there was a really nice paper from a couple of years ago from the University of Manchester. And in that, they made a couple of really telling comments. The first one is that data movement can be hindered by numerous technical barriers. And I think many of us can accept, you know, the need to sort of build infrastructure, IT, that allows that data to sort of move across. But it's also an aspect of social aspect. So there's also a cultural change and a requirement and a need and a desire to actually help sort of move that data across as well. And that's another aspect that we don't always talk about, but it does need to be discussed. So again, many people are thinking about many of these problems. Data sharing, I think, is probably 4 key facets, and these are taken from the FAIR data principles. And FAIR basically stands for these 4 facets. So data should be findable, data should be accessible, it should be interoperable, which is that those data sets which are not, well, you know, let's be clear, you know, not everything is in an Excel file, so it can't just be moved across. Sometimes data sits within proprietary formats because it's come off a machine that sits within a laboratory. Data needs to be reusable. And I think this is a really important aspect when we think about this sort of this understanding of the reproducibility crisis. And there was a really nice set of articles in Nature, and I would encourage people to sort of look at some of the things in there, because we are finding that the ability to reproduce the data that's being published is not always straightforward. And one of the things that we're finding is that we're observing sort of data analysis errors. We're also recognizing this unconscious bias that we're sort of seeing when people do essentially the analysis of their own data. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. One other aspect that is not included in these FAIR facets is also the need to make sure that we're tracking data. So particularly in early drug discovery, understanding where we're sharing data and across organizations, particularly in a collaboration is absolutely critical for understanding IP, for instance. So this is another aspect that we've been thinking about too. And it was almost set up for this presentation, but two of my colleagues at the Medicines Discovery Catapult, Peter Simpson and Graham Wilkinson, have recently put this comment into Nature Reviews Drug Discovery. And they talk about how drug discovery is moving to a much more collaborative, much more consortium-based method for doing science. We've also seen that actually the funding to do science is very much encouraging of collaborative ventures. So if we think about Horizon 2020, IMI calls, for instance, it's very much based about actually building a collaboration, a consortium of organizations who are going to contribute into a bigger science opportunity. That's kind of come at the same time, but in parallel with larger organizations potentially looking to sort of outsource those capabilities or perhaps slim down sort of in-house capabilities. So people are looking outside of their organizations in order to bring in skills and capabilities that might not have previously exist. It allows for sharing of risks. It also allows for sharing of costs, which is important. And it kind of offers the ability to share the opportunities that are to us, particularly when they're in pre-competitive space. So certainly in some areas that I've worked in, the safety side is very much an area that is seen as being pre-competitive, because we all need to sort of encourage that to do more. But Peter and Graham, we're very much in agreement that many of the things that need to be done is to make sure that we're thinking about security for data sharing. We need to think about this auditable aspect, and we need to think about transparency. People need to be clear about who is sharing and where that data is going. And of course, as we create and generate more data, drug discovery fundamentally is becoming an increasingly data science-led activity. And this idea about scientific collaboration, again, was captured really nicely in a review article from Science a couple of years ago. Again, the DOI is down the link down the bottom here. I'd encourage you to look at it. It's a really interesting study. And it talks very much about this idea that people are becoming much more collaborative, finding teams, putting together small teams, which tend to be a little bit more disruptive, to larger teams, which tend to be about doing good science, but at a larger scale. There's a quote in this paper which was really interesting, where they sort of say in 1955, within science and engineering teams, about half of the papers that were published came from a single author. And yet by 2013, the number of those papers from single authors dropped down to 10%. And so we're seeing a much larger increase of papers and publications being done by teams. This graph at the bottom just exemplifies that one further. So the two lines essentially is the mean size of the team from publications. The red dotted line is all publications. The black line is when you sort of select off the more higher citation papers. And when you look at the sort of higher, more highly cited papers, then actually you see an even higher than average team size. And of course, it makes sense, because having large groups of teams, having large consortiums, means that there are more people essentially talking about the science that you do. And so that actually translates into a high number of citations. So it's good science, and it's good for the metrics that many of us are sort of led by. So this is quite a wordy slide. I apologize for that, but this is important to sort of think about, a real life example of why and how people are thinking about data sharing. So I've been sort of watching and sort of observing a consortium and a sort of global sort of piece of work, very much thinking about the electrophysiology from a cardiac safety perspective. And this has been a really interesting project called the SIPA project, where they've been looking to sort of generate data within different laboratories across the world, but wanting to understand how they compare and how they rank up. Because understanding experimental variability in a particular assay, when you've got a defined SOP, is really important for how you actually go on and interpret and analyze that data beyond it. So when you start doing that, you need to think about who's going to sort of handle the data, who's going to sort of be essentially brokering that data. How do you make sure it's done fairly and sort of transparently as well? And so a piece of work has really been very interesting. There's some papers that have just come out towards the end of last year, where they've essentially talked about how they've done this kind of cross comparison across multiple sites and multiple organizations, essentially doing those same experiments to be able to understand the fundamental variability that we see in the data. And different scientists have different views and different desires about what they want to do with that data. And this is another key aspect, which is making sure that although you might, as an experimentalist, for instance, have a particular view about how the data should be analysed. Someone else might have a completely different view about of what you could do. And we need to allow different people to be able to look at the same data sets in different ways, in a much more collaborative way. And it's not sort of, this is my data, I'm not prepared to share it. And so I've just given a couple of examples down the bottom here about who might want to look at it. So a data modeler, for instance, might like to train, for instance, an AI model, for instance, to be able to look at that raw trace data in order to be able to pick out features that are not obvious from just looking at it as a human being. Safety scientists, for instance, might not care about necessarily that raw data. They just want to know whether a drug is safe or not. And so they're much more interested in the sort of aggregated effects that a particular drug might be doing to these drugs. A lab experimentalist, for instance, might want to publish that data. They may want to make it available, put it into a system that allows it to be used by others. But at the same time, they want some recognition for doing that. And typically, scientists might hold back data until it's been able to publish. Certainly, if we think about how the climate modeling community do it, they very much get a DOI link, so almost like a publishable, credited piece of work, simply for sharing that data. And so when people then go in and analyze and use that data, credit is essentially given back to those people generating that data. And that's a really important aspect for encouraging actually the sharing of data. So we might date the data from those experiments that we've just been talking about. In this case, it was MEA, multi-electrode array experiments. And it can split into two lots. It can split into that kind of summarized view versus that raw data. The raw data typically is, can be very large. For instance, the summary data can be much more sort of Excel spreadsheet level sort of data sets. Both have value and both are necessary, and both can be seen by different users. So a safety pharmacologist, for instance, might be interested in that summary level data. A modeler, a data analyst, data scientist might still be interested in the summary level data, but perhaps more from a sort of checking that the models that they have built have some accuracy and some prediction scores. A computational model, for instance, might actually want the raw data to be able to sort of train their models and to sort of build the analytical platforms on top of it. So I just want to summarize this kind of first phase of the presentation. We've seen this idea of this big science. Big science is requiring much more collaboration. Not only that, people are wanting to be more collaborative. People are looking to actively set up consortiums and share data across those consortiums. As a result, collaboration absolutely requires you to do that data sharing. You can't sort of hold data on personal laptops or sort of company laptops. It needs to be sort of shared across so that other people can look at it too. If you accept that, then actually the data sharing therefore requires you to make technological and also cultural changes in order to allow that to sort of happen much more seamlessly. And so for a second phase of this webinar today, I want to talk a little bit about how the Medicines Discovery Catapult, or MDC, is looking to support the biopharma sector in doing exactly those types of things. So I'm going to sort of split into sort of three sections, which I've kind of called the idea of sort of collaborative data, about the ability to share, some thinking about actually how you interpret and analyze that data once you've shared it. And then finally, a really key aspect is the developing the solutions, sometimes of those hard problems. So as we generate that data, it's going to induce us to ask more and more questions. And that's exactly what we want to do. We need to be asking more questions of the data that we're then sharing. Sometimes we need to go and invent ways that we then can answer some of those questions. And that's certainly an aspect that we're very keen to sort of explore at the MDC. So just some ideas within each of these themes. Data sharing approaches can often be heterogeneous across organizations. And what I mean by heterogeneous is that they might be using different systems in order to share their data. People might be using Google Docs, other people might be using Office 365. That in itself is a relatively straightforward problem to solve, but already we're starting to see different ways of people analyzing, working with their data. If we then start introducing the sort of machinery in which we're developing the data from, that increases much more the sort of proprietary data sets and the need to sort of work with those systems. So data can look quite different, and we need to think about how it's going to work across. And this is this problem of interoperability that we talked about earlier with the FAIR principles. Once you have that data and you have it shared, people are looking to develop insights. Data is a very rich area that we can find new things out in the same way that this team of people have been trying to understand the epidemiology of COVID by sort of sharing and pooling resources and looking at the data as a collaboration. So too, many people want to look at the data in different ways. Many people are trying to use computational approaches in order to spot patterns and insights that are not necessarily obvious early on. One other aspect is that many companies don't necessarily have the skill sets and the ability to do some of these things. Some of these are very technical, very tricky, and small organizations that we've seen don't necessarily have a team of AI scientists that they can call on in order to be able to help them with data science. So this is another challenge, I think, for the community what we want to share. There are also vendors, for instance, who do have those skill sets, and they want to be able to work with those industries, and they need to know what those questions are that are being asked. So organizations are looking to socialize common industry problems. We need help with analyzing this type of data set. At the same time, the vendors, the people who can tackle those problems, want to know what those questions are too. So again, we've been thinking about how we can do that. So this figure just talks a little bit about some of our thinking behind one of the projects that we're currently working on, and sort of mentioned it before in this webinar, in that we sort of experimentalists and scientists are generating data, and typically those scientists will perform some analysis. Will perform analysis on their data through the experimentation, and along this arrow here, we're actually creating more and more abstractions of that data. We move away from those raw data sets, and we produce something which looks and tells a story in a much more convincing pattern. And when we have something that we're prepared to share, then we'll share, maybe it's a publication, maybe it's a PowerPoint presentation, together with potentially consortium partners or other people outside of that organization, which is represented by this dotted line, which is moving data across organizations. But sometimes what happens is that those people will then sort of think, oh, we might like to look at that data again. Is there something else that we haven't perhaps indicated? I think of an example where we did some work in the cardiac safety arena, where the interesting data to us was not the test compounds that have been run through that assay, but actually that control sample that was done over and over and over again. And when we look back through time, we actually realized that it had been done, sort of 10,000 times. And that gave us 10,000 data points in order to start to understand this variation that you can potentially see in experiments. And that helps you to understand what you might then do with it. So different people, again, will have different views about what you could do with that data. So we need to make that a little bit more efficient. So where we'd like to go in a future perspective is where the sharing of that data is done, across the analysis pipeline, so that people are able to see the different ways that we've approached it. And so collaboration is not just sharing data at a sort of highly curated form, but actually collaboration and sharing starts at a much earlier stage too, so that different people from across organizations can contribute to the analysis pathways too. So we see that data is shared between organizations using a lot of file transfer. So Dropbox, Google Docs, Office 365 are very common forms of sharing data across organizations. and they're very good, but they don't necessarily always have necessarily the security and the auditability that we might want to have of our data sets. We want to know who may have looked at that data. We want to know who may have changed that data. To have that audited trail, we need to think a little bit more about how we share data. So the work that we're trying to work with this project is to tackle those issues in order to sort of lower that transactional cost, essentially improve the efficiency of how we are sharing data between partners, and also to make sure that we're doing that in a secure and allowing for a much more virtual research and development. So that project, which we're calling the Collaboratory, might work a little bit like this, for instance. So Sue, who works for one organization, wants to share some data with a consortium partner in organization Y. Sue puts that data into a system, and Amrik, who's in the other organization, receives an alert that that data has been added in there. He accepts those data changes. He wants to integrate it with his data systems, and in turn wants to return some new analysis that they've been done. At the other end, that passes back to Sue in the first organization, who can then see what work has been done and may then be able to sort of accept and update her system. So much more sort of timely sharing of the data and the analysis that's been conducted between that consortium, between those consortium partners. And you can imagine this will get increasingly interesting as you increase the number of organizations and people who are sort of operating. I want to move now onto that second phase of those three, which is more about the interpretation of data. So we've started sharing data, and that's all very well and good. But what are we going to do with it? How do we actually give those insights? How do we start understanding a little bit more about what we can do with it? So this is a case study that we've conducted at the Medicines Discovery Catapult. We worked in partnership with the Multiple Sclerosis Society. And the question that came to us was, given what we've seen in the past, can we get some indications of where we might go in the future with respect to developing new drugs? So the approach we took was to look at all trials, all clinical trials that have been conducted in the multiple sclerosis area, and identify the drugs that have been indicated from those. And we found about nearly 2,000 different trials for which drugs have been used. When you actually look at the unique drug intervention, that actually boils down to a lot more. So there are many trials which will be looking at the same drug, for instance. So when you look at the number of individual drug interventions, we're now down below 900. When you then look at the mechanisms, the targets of what those drugs are hitting, actually it goes down even further. And now we're actually talking about, like 40 or so different molecular targets for which those drugs are interacting with. We then sort of filtered out to unique biological mechanisms, recognizing that different targets may feed into the same biological networks. And we identified 22 unique mechanisms that we then wanted to do some analysis on. So using some proprietary algorithms in-house, we then expanded out from those 22 mechanisms in order to understand what the potential drug interventions could be, what drugs that are not being used in multiple sclerosis could actually have value in order to support sort of novel clinical trials. And so by doing this analysis and by using sort of AI algorithms, we were able to actually come back with a new list of 320 drugs that were complementary to the previous drugs. And we identified drugs that were being used for other indications that you might want to consider for the purpose of multiple sclerosis. Not only that, but you also want to bring in new data sets too. So there's lots of data that's sort of spread out in public repositories. And sometimes you want to be able to then sort of prioritize what those drugs are doing. So for this study, those 320 drugs that we just identified from our AI algorithms, we want to be able to sort of prioritize those and say, of these 320, which would be the ones that we most like to prioritize. And you can think that this might be the sort of study and the sort of thing that's also conducted with the current COVID crisis. So bringing those extra pieces of data, those extra columns of this data table might include, for instance, like what is the drug target? What are the physical? What are the ADMET properties? What is the route of administration? Are there any adverse events or safety warnings? Are there any drug label warnings that we need to be aware of? What dosing? What are the cost of these drugs that are being used? Bringing those pieces of data in and integrating into what we've already seen before allows us to sort of start bringing up different mechanisms to be able to prioritize the drugs that we've identified. And so we believe that actually not only sort of collecting the data, performing some analysis, but also sort of making sure that we're essentially adding those extra columns here on the right-hand side is a really good way of actually sort of adding value to the analysis that we're doing. Finally, I'm going to finish with one example of where we're thinking about how we actually support the sector in tackling those problems, tackling those insights and those questions that are being asked, really to sort of help develop solutions. So we see that that many organizations want to ask questions. They want people to come back with solutions. And we feel that there's a mechanism that we can do and help those organizations to sort of find that way. So this is very much this understanding of who does what. Is there some sort of matchmaking that can be done? Again, we're seeing exactly this type of opportunity sort of working quite strongly with the COVID work that's currently ongoing. People saying, I can do this. Is there anyone who would benefit from doing that? We want to make sure that we help those organizations, both from the people who are asking the questions and for the people who think they can solve those problems, bringing them together and making sure that we get some leverage and sort of get some insights. And by doing so, I think we will encourage a much more collaborative way of developing and coming to solutions for these problems. So these are just a couple of ways that we've been thinking about how we tackle some of these challenges, but also some of these opportunities of data sharing within the sector. And it would be really good to sort of to learn more from the people on this webinar. Please, get in touch with us afterwards. And we'd be delighted to have a conversation about any of these aspects that we've talked today. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for sticking with us and for listening from wherever you are. And we'll now open it up to some sort of questions. Thank you very much. Okay, so I've got a number of questions here. Okay, so thanks to David here, David Parkinson. We'd like to look at the Collaboratory project. How will you ensure that it maintains innovation and updates so that it doesn't end up in antiquated versions similar to SharePoint? Absolutely. I mean, these are all challenges that we do. When we look at, certainly many of our team have been involved with the construction of sort of biological drug databases, for instance, and we know that the construction of databases can often sort of flow with particularly a PhD project. And it's much more important that we think about the legacy and how we actually sort of make sure that is updated. So we definitely be sort of looking to make sure that we develop this along the way and answering those sort of questions. And that could be just the way that we structure. But it looks like you might have some thoughts about that, David, and I'd be really keen to sort of make sure that we perhaps sort of follow up on this. So you asked a second question about the data enriching piece. So from that, I'm kind of assuming that that's the analysis bit that we did. So no, we'd see that as separate, but part of it as well. When we think about the work that we're doing in the Collaboratory project, that's more about how do you move data between organizations in a fairly seamless way, and that allows people to look at that data. What individual organizations then go and do with that data would be a completely separate product. That would be something that each individual organization would then bring their own insights and their own sort of their skills to bear, And that also keeps the competitiveness within the field as well. People might want to sort of share data, but they don't necessarily always want to share the ways of looking at things. Okay, are there any more questions? I think have we got a couple in the chat? No. Well, look, it's been really interesting talking to you. You know, as we adapt to this new world where, you know, our lives are now run on Zoom. What I would love for you to do is to follow up. My email is out there. Please reach out, connect. If there's areas that you agree with, if there's areas you disagree with, it'd be great to hear from you. I would love to have that conversation. Thank you for joining. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon wherever you are, and stay safe. Thank you.